let's make sure we apply it to the object, and now we need to create some lights. So the simplest light, we can create a V-Ray rectangle light. Scale that up. Let's just do a top light for now. Rotate that at -90. Raise it up. And its intensity is probably a little bright for being that close to the subject, so let's take that down to about 10. And we'll crop our scene so we know what we're framing. Change this to the V-Ray render buffer, and under the V-Ray buffer we'll load our preset and change that to Gaussian in case your preset doesn't have it. Mine for some reason doesn't. Change that to 3. Indirect illumination should be fine, and let's just up our scatter, or rather our pre-pass rate to 0. And let's take a look at a very quick render here. Render perspective. Make sure your sRGB is active. That's our pre-pass. It's just calculating a light cache. So I just paused the render, paused the recording just so the render sped up for you guys. You can see it's way blown out. We're nowhere close yet. But one particular thing to note, other than being too bright, is the lips here. We're seeing some strange little bright areas where I would think it'd be darker in here. I can tell you from experience that that is generally caused by this object not reflecting itself. And knowing that when you import OBJs, there is a Maya attribute that you should switch. Under render stats, every time you import an OBJ, it will have set visible and reflections and refractions to off. That is massively annoying, and you need to turn those back on so that the lips will reflect itself. Right now the top of this lip is seeing the light above it, and that's why it's so bright. So we'll change that. While we're at it, we'll make the light less bright. Take that down to say 5, half that. Zoom out a little bit. And one other thing we'll give a try doing is to increase the scatter radius to enhance our subsurface scattering effect. So let's do that. We'll double that. Actually, let's triple it to 3 centimeters and see what that does. Remember, your object is to scale. I'm also going to change a setting here where instead of our render region of 64 by 64, we'll make it smaller. That sometimes is more efficient to render. And oh look, our dynamic memory limit is quite low. We'll up that. Apparently my preset didn't change that as it should. And that should do it. So let's render one more time. That's our pre-pass. And now we're rendering final pass. Now already you can see the lips are essentially fixed, but because I increased the scatter radius to 3 times its original amount, there's a lot of light scattering around this object, and it's definitely too much for realistic skin. It's also pretty noisy in the shadows, which is to be expected given my low settings. And let's improve quality a little bit by giving some bounce light. It's amazing what one light can do for a subject given a little bit more model. So let's create a polygon plane. So we have a little light bouncing up from the ground. Let's turn our scatter radius back down. Say we bring it to about half that, so 1.5. And let's give that one more render. Alright, so that's the finished render. You can see there's a little more light bouncing, obviously, from below up onto his skin, so things are a little less contrasty. And we have a pretty good start on subsurface scattering. We haven't done much for specular yet, so let's take a look at doing that. Also, it's still pretty noisy. I forgot to up the quality. So let's go to V-Ray threshold and turn that to 0.015. That'll give us a little better quality. So let's look at the specular info. So we're done with diffuse and SSS for now. Well, actually, let's mention this. Scatter color, this is based on the preset. So we're dealing with an internal sort of red blood color. You can brighten that up if you want to sort of enhance any of those, or enhance any of the subsurface scattering effect. You should know also that index of refraction has an effect both on the scattering and how light scatters inside the surface, and also the specular, which is what we're about to address. Since skin is essentially water-based, we're dealing with an index of refraction very close to water. So this preset makes sense for skin. That will affect how the specular works as well. So right now we've got a full specular. It is Fresnel based on, you don't even have to check Fresnel. Skin surfaces are always Fresnel. So it doesn't even really give you that option. If you want to use a specular component that is something other than Fresnel, like a chrome finish on the outside, you could just turn specular off and then blend this material with a V-Ray material on top with its own specular component. But we're going to deal with this. So specular amount and color are generally up all the way, and the glossiness you can see is at 0.5, which makes for a very blurry reflection. It's generally about right for dry skin. I tend to up the glossiness or make it a little more shiny at times just to see what the skin does. And down here in options is something else to note. We're currently not scattering global illumination. And we should. There's not a whole lot of GI going on here. It's one light, so we don't need it. So let's, instead of lighting this with one overhead light, let's use an IBL or a dome light, and then scattering GI will make a difference. Alright, so let's create a dome light. Go into the options here, and let's grab a texture for the dome text. Turn off quadratic and go into my HDRI collection. So assets, HDRI. A good collection of HDRI is the SIBL collection. I've downloaded a number of free HDRIs. They're very nice quality, and you can get them at hdrlabs.com and go to the Smart IBL. And you've got archives, the SIBL archive. And you can download a whole ton of HDRIs there. I don't generally use the SIBL software, which they try to package in as well. Not that it's bad software, I think it's brilliant, but V-Ray sort of makes it easy enough to not have to deal with that. So we're just going to use a texture directly. Another reason to you may not bother with SIBL software to automate the setup is because V-Ray has very efficient importance sampling, so you can use a high-res HDR map, and SIBL tends to break out your lighting dome light from your reflection dome light, and that's not necessarily required in V-Ray. So let's use Old Industrial Hall. I like gritty industrial places, so we're going to use the reflection map because it's clear, it's the highest res image. Now if we back up to the light, we must check use dome texture. We can change the texture resolution that it's sampling, so I'm going to up that to 1024, and I shall make sure dome spherical is on, and you'll notice in our background we actually get our environment visible. So usually I have to turn the dome light up a little bit in intensity, so let's up it to 2 and give us a test render. Now there you go. So I did forget to get rid of that overhead light up top his head, so he's a little over bright in this scene, and this is clearly showing that he's scattering too much light. He's definitely too waxy looking. So you can tell that we went up with our where's our radius, scatter radius. We increased it to 3. It was way too much. 1.5 is too much. Here we are back to the original setting at 1. Guess what? That preset was better than I thought. So one thing you can note is that the eyebrows are very dark because they're not receiving any subsurface scatter. You'll also note that I did not put any diffuse amount on here, so that's something we should remedy. While I hooked up a diffuse color, the diffuse amount is still at 0, so he's not receiving any diffuse amount. It's all subsurface scatter through his skin. So I tend to like to give him a little diffuse, maybe at a 0.15 or a 0.2. Let's give him a 0.2. And let's get rid of that light overhead. We won't delete it, we'll just disable it. And we'll zoom in a little bit for better detail. So there's our render, and you can see it's looking better. It's looking a little flat, but that's generally good when you're viewing this by default in the V-Ray frame buffer. One thing you can do is adjust, use post correction here in the V-Ray frame buffer to estimate how you're going to be doing post later. You'll generally want to add a little more contrast and brightness. So let's take a look at my controls here. I've added a little bit of curve here at the bottom range to push down the blacks and raise up the near brights. So if I use the color curve correction, you'll see that's what it does. I'll show you quick. This was, if you watched my previous frame buffer video, you should be familiar with using these controls. But this can really bring out a more realistic tone to your image and making the skin look all that much better. So that's this stage. We still haven't gone a whole lot into the specular component, so let's take more closer look at that.